So I want to talk about a couple of basic principles of grazing management, both the forage characteristics that influence grazing and the animal characteristics that influence grazing. So we've talked a little bit about the availability, and Johnny kind of covered this on how that affects intake in animals. We've talked a little bit about the different plant species, the grasses, legumes, the forbs, and we know that different classes of different species of animals may select one over the other. Let's say goats may select a forb before they're going to select a grass, whereas cattle want to select a legume over their selecting grass. So a couple things to think about. The plant part, is it vegetative? Is it stemmy? That's going to impact digestive rate of that forage through that animal. If we think about the growth stage, the same thing. And then just overall, the nature of our pasture and our canopy. Do we have a lot of desirable species out there? Do we have a lot of undesirable species out there that those animals are selectively grazing through? What is the height of that canopy? Are they going to be able to go out there and especially a cow, wrap their tongue around that good forage and bring it back into their mouth? Or are they going to have to go out there and barely get a little bit in their mouth at a time because that grass is so short? We got to think about the density of the forage, the stem to leaf ratio. Are those animals having to chew some of that more fibrous forage that may have already put a seed head up? It's going to take them a little bit longer to ruminate that forage. And the amount of forage that's live versus dead out there. Do we have a drought, and is that forage looking pretty tough out there? If we think about the grazing management and the animal perspective, we've got to think about how much that animal needs per day, how much forage intake that animal can eat. We've got to think about the density of our stocking rate or stocking density that we may have on our pastures. How many head per acre over time do we have those animals out there for? We've also got to think about the residue. What's that stop grazing height? Where do we want to leave that forage at so that we can make sure that we have adequate regrowth? And then thinking about the time that it needs to regrow. The length of the grazing period plus the length of the rest period. So how fast can maybe we move back onto that pasture after we've already had some type of grazing event? And so, there's a lot of different styles of grazing that we can do that we're going to talk about. And Dr. Poor's already kind of mentioned this, but really adaptive grazing management. I'm going to go through a couple scenarios of different grazing styles or grazing techniques that we can use, and really think about your own farm and how you can adapt each one of these grazing techniques into your own operation. What I can do at my farm, you may not be able to do at your farm, or you may take that grazing style that I have and tweak it just a little bit so that it works for you. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So we've got a lot of different grazing methods to consider, but really kind of two of the main grazing methods that we have is that low management grazing system, where we are not intensively managing anything. And when I say intensively management, don't think about going out there and rotating animals every 2 hours. You can make that intensive management what it is to you. Maybe you rotate every 5 days, 7 days. At home, I rotate every couple of months on some of our mountain pastures. So what does that mean to you? From our low management grazing systems, we've got that continuous stocking where we've got no pasture divides. Those animals are just continuously out there throughout the year. And then we've got a several different rational grazing or rotational grazing systems that I want to talk about today. And maybe some of these you've heard of, maybe some of them you hadn't, but if there's something that you haven't heard about, think about how you could use that in order to help you on your own farm today. So we've got a lot of potential benefits of grazing management, and I say potential benefits because it looks different from one farm to the next. So what happens as we go from maybe a non-intensive grazing system where we're overstocked to a more intensive grazing system where we've reduced the stocking rate and we're starting to play more active management in those animals and really being proactive on how we allow them to graze. So some things that we may see out there as we go from this non-intensive to intensive grazing system, as we get our stocking rate correct, we're probably going to see an increase in forage production. Those plants that are out there, the plants that we want to be out there are going to be more persistent. They're going to be more productive. They can grow more forage, and they're going to be able to compete with weeds more because we're giving them a better chance at basically a better chance at life. So we might actually see less weed pressure in our pastures. Some other things from a grazing efficiency standpoint, we're going to see better nutrient distribution as we're forcing those animals to be in certain areas for certain periods of time. We know that we can really control where that feces and urine is dropping. And we see a better utilization of forage. We're able to control that grazing, and so we can allow those animals to better utilize the forage that's out there. We also know that from a stocking rate standpoint, we can increase our gain per acre. Notice I didn't say gain per animal, but specifically gain per acre. And then if we think about it, and this is one thing that Johnny and Dr. Poor like to talk about, is really the disposition of our animals. The more that we're out there in our animals, the more that they get used to us, their disposition is overall better. Personally, for myself, I don't like to have one of those crazy animals out there that, every time you walk in the pasture, you're worried that they may come and kill you. So getting them used to you being out there and working with them every day is a positive in my mind. So thinking about these different grazing systems and what does that look like? I think we all probably know what a continuous stocking grazing system looks like, where we've got just one big pasture. We've got animals out there all the time. We are allowing them to continuously graze. But the danger of this in this system, if we are overstocked and we've got too many animals out there, they keep that grass extremely short, is that every single day that those animals have a chance to go back to that same plant and nibble that plant off, right? So we never actually allow those plants to rest because it always has that chance of that animal coming back through there and grazing that plant again. So what happens in this system where we are overgrazing, our overall efficiency is somewhere between that 30 to 40%. Now, I will say that we've got a lot of people throughout the Southeast that are continuously grazing their pastures, and they're doing an awesome job doing that. But the key here is making sure that our stocking rate is accurate and we're not overgrazing and we don't have too many animals out there. Now, I will say a lot of times in a continuous grazing system, oftentimes I see this picture instead of a good green lush pasture. We've got too many animals out there in that pasture. They're overgrazing that pasture. And you can see basically there's not a lot of grass out here. And you could say, well, maybe it's wintertime and there's just not a lot of grass growing. But if we start looking behind here in the picture, and again, this is where the taking it all in and thinking about the system as a system, right? We know that there's green leaves on these trees back here, so it's definitely grass growing season, but yet we have no grass in these pastures for these animals to graze. We see some weeds that are popping up, and the reason that we see these weeds popping up are because those are the undesirable species to those animals, and so they're not grazing those plants. And so what really happens in this scenario, if we think about forage growth, is that those animals are coming back, and every time that plant just barely starts to grow a little bit, that animal comes back and nips that plant right back off. So we never get out of this what we call the phase one area of growth. And really, if we think about plants and plant growth, we've got about 3 phases of growth where that plant starts to grow green tissue. As those solar panels start to come online on that plant, we see a lot of rapid growth coming on. And then that growth starts to slow down as those leaves start to get older. They don't photosynthesize quite as efficiently as the younger leaves. And then oftentimes in the springtime, we can see that seed head popping up. So what happens with our growth rate is that early on, that growth rate's slow, but as we allow those solar panels to come on that plant, we see a lot of rapid growth. But in a continuously overgraze system, we often never get out of that phase one where we've got that kind of lag in growth. And there's some other things that's going on that we can't see underground in this overgraze system. Oftentimes when an animal goes in there and graze that green tissue off, that tissue obviously is gone. And in order for that plant to grow back, when we overgraze a plant, it's got to bring up those carbohydrates or those sugars from the root reserves. And so some of those root reserves will die back as it moves those sugars upwards to produce new tissue. Now, what happens in this scenario is that if we allow it to grow and produce a lot of forage, then it puts those carbohydrate reserves back into those roots. However, if we graze it when it barely starts to grow back in the overgrazed system, and we graze it again, then those roots die back a little bit more. And eventually that plant will more than likely die because we've taken all of its reserves out of that plant. So really, proper rest following a grazing event is really key to longevity of forages. And so I love this picture from the University of Florida, where they were grazing this grass every 2, 7, or 21 days. So they either came in here and had a grazing event every 2 days, every 7 days, or allowed this forage to rest for 21 days. And you can see a pretty big difference in the amount of carbohydrate reserves in those roots, or the amount of root dry matter between those 3 different grazing events. So in continuously overgrazed pastures, most plants are grazed every 2 to 7 days. And so with recommended rest periods, roots will put nutrients and carbohydrates back into those roots. So we've got to think about that. And I've already showed you this picture just as a reminder that we've got these grazing rules of thumb where we need to stop grazing, move those animals on, and allow that pasture to recover. So a couple other items of grazing systems I want to talk about is really this theory of rationing out forages for animals to graze. And probably the most familiar term is a rotational grazing system. And a rotational grazing system can take many forms. It could be a pretty slow rotation where maybe you graze for a month and then move those animals on, and graze for a month and move those animals on. And so in this situation, we've got a lot of rest time for those forages. Let's say we've got, 30, 60-day period of rest for those forages before we come back and graze that. And so we increase our overall efficiency because we allow those forages to rest and develop new green tissue. In a more moderate grazing situation where we've got more paddocks, we're moving those animals more frequently, we're going to continue to increase the amount of time those pastures are resting and our overall grazing efficiency. So there's been a lot of work done looking at continuous grazing system versus rotational grazing system. And kind of just the big key takeaway here is that in those two systems, we really don't see a big difference in cow weight at weaning, cow pregnancy rate, stocking rate, however, is significant, because in a continuous grazing system, we got to think about reducing our animal numbers to allow that forage to rest, right? Because we don't want a lot of animals out there to go out there and kind of pick that grass every couple of days, which depletes the energy reserves and allows that plant to die. But in a rotational grazing system, we can actually increase our stocking rate and our cow-calf units per acre. But the big key thing here in a cow-calf system is in a rotational grazing system, we're not necessarily going to increase our calf weaning weight, but we are going to be able to increase our calf production in a pound per acre situation, because if that forage is resting in that rotational grazing system, it's able to be more efficient at forage production. Think back to that kind of curve for forage growth, where we're getting out of that lagged phase of growth and entering that rapid phase of growth, so we can have more animal units out there and we produce more animal units or crop of animals off of that land. In this particular study, they were also able to decrease the amount of hay they were feeding, but we're not going to talk about why that is today. So just another type of grazing system that we see is frontal grazing system. We can also, it's a type of strip grazing, basically. And so what this means is that we develop strips that we have a back fence for. And so we have really small areas that we are forcing those animals not to be selective, but we're forcing those animals to graze that forage in that area that we've given them. This is really best used where we need a high utilization of that forage to be utilized. It's really sacrificing a really small area to reduce the pressure on the whole system. Waste potential may be high in this type of grazing system because of the hoof action on that forages, but we can control that with getting our pastures the correct size. And typically we would use this system where animals have a lower nutrient requirement because we're forcing them to eat everything there. They're not allowed just to selectively graze the most nutritious parts of the plant that's there. We're forcing them to graze deeper into the canopy. I really like this picture of this pasture that's being frontal grazed. You can see that there's a back fence here of the wire, and there's must be a waterer on the back side of this farm, and they've got an alleyway that they've created to go to the back side of that farm. And the reason they've created the alleyway is they don't want to damage this pasture that is just grazed, that is trying to regrow. So you can see that they've probably got a next strip already allocated here, and the next one after that's going to be allocated there. So strip grazing is also another method of grazing where we've got a fence, and as those animals eat what is before them, we can then kind of push that fence forward and allow them to graze kind of that next little area. And so where we see strip grazing really utilized at is where we have high utilization, but we're not really worried about the forages regrowing. We're not worried about them back grazing, like say to the water trough, and disrupting the forage regrowth. So basically strip grazing, a lot of people use it when stockpiling forages, specifically stockpiled fescue to strip graze fescue, maybe crop residues. Let's say that you've got some corn planted somewhere that you've harvested, and now they're able to graze the corn residue or maybe the cotton residue. We often see this in overly mature summer annuals at the end of summer when we're not worried about regrowth. We just want those animals to go out there and harvest that forage. And so some common uses for strip grazing, we've got a picture here of stockpiled tall fescue and stockpiled Bermuda grass on the bottom. Maybe we've got some brassicas that we're not worried about regrowth, and of course that crop residue. And so just another picture of beef heifers in a scenario that we could use strip grazing. Probably many of you have Johnson grass in your area that you may be battling. And so one good way to battle Johnson grass is allow animals to graze it. So here they're strip grazing Johnson grass. They obviously don't want any regrowth of Johnson grass, considered a weed in this what looks like Bermuda grass hayfield or pasture. And so they're allowing those animals to strip graze that in Georgia. Here's a picture with a different species utilizing strip grazing to graze this what looks like tall fescue in this picture. And so basically the difference between frontal grazing and strip grazing is the amount of regrowth that is expected. In frontal grazing, it's expected to have some type of regrowth. Strip grazing, there's no regrowth expected. So if you think about frontal grazing system, you know, you got to make sure that you've got some type of either alleyway to water, or you're able to have a portable water that you can move with those animals. However, in strip grazing, oftentimes we start closest to the water source or maybe the shade source, so that forage isn't damaged as those animals are going to get a drink or maybe going to lay in the shade. So one of my favorite types of grazing systems is actually creep grazing. And so basically creep grazing would be if you have a calf farm and you've got calves that've got a higher nutrient requirement, you're trying to put more weight on them. And let's say that you allow them to go creep graze and selectively graze the field that you're going to be going into next. Or maybe you have a little bit of area of winter annuals or summer annuals, but not enough for your whole herd. This is a great place where creep grazing can take place. Now, creep grazing can be done in several different ways. In this picture, we have a standard creep gate where those small calves can slip through that creep gate. It's just big enough for those calves to slip through, but those mama cows can't slip through. You can also use just a single strand of poly wire that's low enough that those small animals can slip right under, but those big cows aren't going to test that poly wire. And so there's been some studies done on looking at creep grazing pearl millet on tall fescue-based pastures, where most of the forage base is tall fescue, but maybe we've got 5 or 10 acres of area where we can have pearl millet at. And so we want to use that small acreage high quality forage our best way possible. And so we can do that through creep grazing. And so here just as an example of the control of just tall fescue pasture versus those animals that were able to go and graze that pearl millet. And we see that we've got a pretty big increase in calf gain. Average daily gain was increased by allowing them to have access to that higher quality forage. And we actually were able to improve our cows' body weight too, because we were taking a little bit of nutritional pressure off of those mama cows because those baby calves were getting it somewhere else. So here's just an example of my own farm of creep grazing. A few years ago, I told my dad that we were going to creep graze. It was one of those hard springs that we were having where it was like grass was not coming on, grass would not green up because we had snow in late April, in early April. And so it was just a really late spring. So we set up this little area of creep grazing demonstration, if you will. And so he told me it would never work. And then he sent me this picture one day. You can see the mama cow mad that she's on this side, the baby calves in this little area that we set up. And you can tell a difference in the amount of forage availability on the side the mama cow's on versus the side that the baby calf's on, just from the color. So there's a lot of forages and a lot of systems that have the potential to include creep grazing as a type of grazing method. The last grazing method I want to talk about is limited or time grazing method. And this is really important when you've got maybe some high quality pasture and some low quality pasture, and you really need to just supplement that low quality pasture, and you allow those animals to go in that area and graze periodically, maybe a few hours every day, or maybe every other day you allow them in that area to graze. And this is also works really well if you've got a new stand of perennial established forage and you don't want to go in there and damage it and graze it too hard. You just want to lightly take a little bit off the top. This works really well. And so basically, the theory is you graze alternate days every maybe 2 or 3 hours a day. And we want to think of this limit or time grazing as basically a supplement without going to the feed store and buying some bagged feed. It allows cows to fill up on high quality forage, and then they get to go back and lay in the shade and digest. And so, thinking about how we can utilize this, consider implications of the time of day on grazing behavior. Early in the morning, late in the evening, those animals are going to be out of that shade, out there actively grazing. In the middle of the day, they're probably not going to make use of that forage. Also, I've had questions about, well, how can you use this? Because how could I ever get those animals back out? Well, if you've got an area that maybe doesn't have water, good quality forage, doesn't have water, doesn't have shade, that's a great way to allow them in, and then they're going to be seeking that water or that shade. So you can use those different tools to help manage this type of grazing system. So the last one is the leader follower. This works really well if you've got maybe multi-species on your farm, or you've got animals that have different nutrient requirements on your farm. This basically means you allow the animals that have the highest nutrient requirement to graze through those pastures first, and then you bring a follower grazing group to come in and graze those forages a little bit harder. So that first group is going to select that high quality forage, and that last group is going to come in and basically force them to eat everything else. And so you can see that this works pretty well with those first animals coming in and just taking a little bit off the top, really being able to take that leaf where that protein and energy is highest at. And then those last grazers are going to come in and basically graze more of the stem that's left over. So just going to quickly go because I know we're out of time. This picture is a good one of first grazers or top grazers coming in and grazing the top of this pasture first, the really green leafy material, and then these steers come in and graze even deeper into that canopy. So just think about how these grazing management systems can help you, and think about the different grazing styles that you could implement on your farm to help better manage both the forage and the livestock. And so lastly, one of the questions that we get all the time is, well, I can't intensively graze or I can't rotationally graze because it takes way too much time to do that. And I've just got a video here of 2 producers here in the mountains that have stockpiled fescue that they're grazing. And so they are able to graze stockpiled fescue for most of the winter time. They make a joke saying it takes a lot less time for them to reel up a roll of polywire than it does to go out there and crank that old tractor, try to get it started, spray some starter fluid in there, finally get that tractor started, and then go feed a bale of hay. And so I can show you just how quick this is. This basically took them about, I think it was a minute and 40 seconds to roll up this wire and allow these animals onto their next strip of pasture. And this couple also jokes that this is great bonding time for them too as well. And you can see that the animals know exactly what's happening. They're all looking at that forage thinking, hey, we're about to get some good stuff. So just another picture that illustrates a very definitive control of intake and utilization. You can see where these animals have been grazing. This pasture is really uniformly grazed to a consistent height before they were moved on. So this is horses as well. Any species can be managed so that you can really control their grazing. Just think about horses tend to bite close to the soil and short grass, but can be controlled with temporary electric fences or adaptive grazing management as well. And so, Paul, with that, that's all I've got. So I guess now we have a little bit of time for questions. So feel free to ask questions if you have any.
All right. Thanks, Deidre. Some great principles and that we can put to practice. We do have a handful of questions and a few more coming in, so definitely keep them coming. I'll just start here at the top. This one goes to Johnny. Johnny, the question was, you used 90 pounds for each body condition score in a cow. What's that translate to in a ewe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I probably should have included that in the session. And I did confer with Dr. Weaver on this just to make sure I was thinking right. But on sheep, it's somewhere between body condition scores. It's about 12% of their body weight. So if you're going from one condition score to the next, probably on that 150-pound ewe in this example would be 18 pounds. I would probably just say 20 just for easy math. And then I would know how many days that I would have to change that. And you could figure out how many pounds per day that the ewe needs to gain and get her on that right plan of nutrition to do that.
Yeah, good, great. All right. The second question, Deidre, we'll throw this one to you. How or where can I obtain hay or forage testing for nutrient analysis? And in this question, the individual was here in North Carolina, but maybe you could address it really anywhere in the country.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Here in North Carolina, you can work with your local extension agent to submit a sample to NCDA. We're really lucky here in North Carolina. It costs $10 a sample to submit a forage sample, a hay sample. So work with your county extension agent. They will have, if you are talking about, sampling preserved forage like hay or silage, they have some tools in their office that they can help get that sample. If you're talking about fresh forage, just make sure you take a representative sample of the field. That also pertains to hay. Put it in a plastic bag, a gallon Ziploc bag, and then you can actually fill out the information yourself if you'd like on NCDA's website. But it costs $10. It's a great way to figure out what's in your forages. Other states also have a testing lab. If you're in any other state, I know Tennessee does, Georgia does, Alabama does. Just work with your local county extension representative to get that done. If you're not in a state, or if you're in a state that does not have a forage testing lab, there's a lot of different commercial labs that you can send these forage samples to. Cumberland Valley Analytical Service or Dairy One can test your forages for you.
All right, thanks. Dr. Poor, here's one for you on pasture renovation. And so the question is, if I need to renovate a pasture, how how do I balance that with my animals? What do I do with those animals while I'm renovating that pasture? And maybe too, to add to the question, how long is it going to take me before that pasture is available to me?
Okay, that's a great question, Paul. And of course, we're going to talk about renovation, I think the next one in more detail. But when you have, if you need to renovate your pastures, you're going to have to find some way to replace the forage that would grow during that period that pasture is not in production. So there's several options. One is you have to reduce the demand, as Johnny kind of laid out. And you have a certain amount of forages needed. You could reduce the number of animals that you have for a few years, depending on how extensive your renovation needs to be. You could find someone to graze those for you. So find someone that would take them on a grazing contract, which is sometimes possible. There are more people that have cover crops on cropland and that sort of thing that they would be interested in some contract cattle. And the other option is to buy hay, to replace it with purchased hay or other feeds. That would mean maybe putting more pressure on your sacrifice area, because you would be spending more days feeding hay than you maybe normally would. Let's see. And then the final option, and something that might make more sense to some people, is to go ahead and put a little bit of additional inputs into the rest of the pastures that you're not choosing to renovate. So that would be using a little bit more nitrogen, a little bit higher level of grazing management, maybe, and probably the best thing would be to combine all of those strategies and cull a little deep, reduce animals a little bit, and then increase those inputs and your attention on the rest of the land, and then maybe add a little bit of hay as well. That's probably the most practical way for somebody to be able to renovate some of your land. Probably about 10 to 20% would be the most you'd ever want to renovate in a year, unless you don't have the animals. But because of that, keeping that something that you can manage, and then using those various strategies to balance the forage demand, be what we would recommend.
Yeah, and I want to add something to that. So if you're planning on renovating, think about why you're thinking about renovating. Is it because you've got a poorly performing pasture? And think about the system as a whole. If you've got a poorly performing pasture, what's the root reason that pasture is not performing well? And think about, back to those physiology and anatomy principles. If you've got a lot of white clover in there, maybe we're overgrazing and we need to destock anyways. And you can always think about doing either a complete renovation or a partial renovation. Think about what the land's telling you. If you've got, 70 to 80% desirable species, but quite a bit of weed pressure out there, we've got some tools in our toolbox where we may not need to do a complete renovation. Maybe we need to take a soil test and look at the pH. Maybe just an application of herbicide, something we haven't tried in the last 5 or 10 years, maybe that can help. So just think about all the tools in the toolbox when it comes to pasture renovation.
Yep, great discussion. Deidre, here's a creep grazing question, and it pertains to small ruminants. Does it work with small ruminants just like it does with cattle?
Yeah, so I think Andrew Weaver's still on here, and he can probably answer the small ruminant system. But I know several producers that have small ruminants that's been creep grazing, specifically here in the mountain region. They oftentimes in the springtime, when they've got those little lambs, they're allowing them to go ahead of their mamas and creep graze that lush forage that's coming on, but they're keeping the mamas and feeding them hay. So I know that it's being done. Andrew, you've got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible. I think if you just use some poly wire and think about the height that's at, I think you could contain the ewes and the lambs could get under. And I think it would just be a little bit of experience and practice figuring out what's the optimum height and things like that to make the system work to keep ewes from escaping. Goats will probably do it naturally.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
think of all of our grazing systems, probably creep grazing is one of our least utilized methods of grazing.
All right, good. We've got one here that deals with establishing pasture from cropland. Is it possible to establish both cool and warm season grasses? And which species would you recommend in the sandhills of North Carolina? I'll just throw that one up. Whoever wants to grab it, grab it.
Well, I think it probably depends on where you are at in North Carolina in the sandhills. We've got a lot of people that have tall fescue pastures, and they're noticing they're starting to thin a little bit. So we've had a lot of people that's went in and established crabgrass in that thinning stand of fescue, and it's worked quite well for a lot of producers. That in the springtime they graze that fescue, in the summertime the crabgrass comes on. It fills in kind of that summer slump in fescue production. And then the fall they go back to grazing fescue. So it's worked well for them. But not all species are going to be compatible. If we start thinking about, interseeding fescue or Bermuda grass or something, those two probably aren't going to be compatible. Johnny or Matt, you've got any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll just, and we probably all three weigh in on this one, but it really will depend a lot on the soil. And again, Deidre's right. Just because you're in the sandhill region doesn't mean you have sandy soils, but for the most part they are. And so Bermuda grass is the grass that is kind of the base in that area, and it's the most productive. Now it requires some nutrients, more nutrients than something like Bahia grass would be another thing that would